Sounds good.
Welcome to another episode of the Roots Podcast. I am your host, Sean Pitcher. Today's guest we have on is Caylen Bufalino. She's a communication coach and owner of Goudie Media Group. I first met Caylen when I was actually at a presentation with Dairy Alliance. She did obviously a training for our group, and I definitely thought she was going to bring a ton of value to the podcast just because communication is all around us. It has to happen every day, and especially in athletics, it's kind of never ending, whether it's with your coaches, your athletes, whether it's with people that are higher up in your business. It's definitely a key attribute and something that we all have to work on a daily basis. But Caylen, welcome.
Thanks, Sean. This is something I've been looking forward to all week because it's rare that I'm on this side of the mic. Usually in what I do, and I know we'll get into it, I'm on the other side where I'm asking the question. So this is quite a pleasure.
Awesome. So what I start with every single person that comes on this podcast is, could you please tell us what your roots are, or who is Caylen behind the scenes?
Yes, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because my roots actually have a lot to do with what I do today in my career. So I grew up here in Chicago, where I was born and raised by parents who also were in communication careers. My dad, Chuck Goudie, has been an investigative reporter here in Chicago for almost 40 years for ABC News. And my mom, Terry Goudie, started our company, Goudie Media, about 30 years ago, back when what we did was called media training. And it was a time where companies and organizations and executives were just starting to realize that in order to tell their story in a more broad and impactful way, they needed to build relationships with reporters. So that's the household I grew up in. I'm the oldest of 5 kids, so I'm very much an alpha, as you might say, as I know many coaches are. And there's a lot that I took from that role as the oldest, as a leader, that I now use in my everyday work. So my roots really are in communication. I also, on a personal level, I'm a mom of 2 very young and active boys, ages 8 and 5. I married a football player. So sports and athletics are something that are also in my roots. I'm a marathon runner. Recently, in the last few years, especially during COVID, built out what I call my dungeon in the basement, where I've really started to focus on lifting heavier weights, especially as I'm getting a little bit older. I know you would tell me, Sean, that's really important to do. So that's kind of where my passions are: being outdoors, being with my kids, staying active, staying healthy. And the other thing to mention is that I have a whole new perspective on health, and I do a lot of work in healthcare because my mom, the founder of our company, passed away last summer. And that's really changed the trajectory of my career as I have taken over the company and really started to lead in a whole new way in the past few years. So that's the overview of my roots. There's a lot of different directions that you could take that, Sean. So I'm curious what you want to know more about.
Well, I think it's funny you mentioned your dungeon. That's one thing me and my fiance would like to do in the future, is to have our own weight room that's going to be in our, whether it's a barn or whether it's going to be where we park our cars, whatever that's going to be. So we have our own little kind of like getaway to go do our training as well.
Yeah, it's good to keep it separate. I totally agree. But it's funny because during the pandemic, as I was starting to do some of these different training sessions, every now and then a box would show up and my husband would go to lift it and it would weigh like 100 pounds because it would be my next set of dumbbells that I had ordered. But I have taken a little break. My dungeon is doing well and thriving.
Yeah, it's always exciting when you get a little bit of a couple more pieces you can add to the puzzle to your weight room for sure. Now, obviously, being in a household with parents that were already in communication, you probably had definitely an advantage when it comes to having people you can go to right away. But let's say someone wants to get into be a communication coach or get into this space.
Mhm.
What is kind of the process to do that? Is it you go to college and go take a bachelor's degree in communication? Is it a mishmash of different types of things that could lead you to this point? Like, could you just kind of tell us what does that path
Mhm.
possibly look like?
Yeah, and I think this is one of those questions that there's no direct answer. I can only speak from my own experience and from those around me. But what I will say is that I work in every industry. And the reason I'm able to coach in every industry is because, as you said at the top of this interview, communication is vital, whether you're an engineer, whether you're a doctor, whether you're an RD, whether you're a CEO or whether you're an intern. It doesn't matter. You need to use communication today in authentic and impactful ways if you want to make a difference, if you want to grow your business. So there is certainly a need right now when it comes to communication. As we know, Social media has totally changed how we connect with each other, how our brains are seeking information, how we're processing things. So as the world continues to change, we're going to need more coaches. So that's how I would approach it, is to ask yourself, is this something that you would want to do? And if you want to hone in on one industry, maybe more behind the scenes, an internal communication role is for you. But if you're like me, someone who I like every day is a little bit different. I like meeting new people and helping them work through their problems, whether it's, trying to come up with a really good core narrative or helping them prepare for an interview on CNN. It doesn't matter what the opportunity is. Again, and Sean, this is what you learned when we were together, is I teach a 5-step method and approach. And again, because my story is unique, I learned this and I honed these skills from a couple of different things. So maybe it might make sense for me to share a bit about my professional background to give a sense of the type of things and skills you need to get to the point where I'm at today. So I obviously grew up, watching my mom and listening to how she taught and how she connected. She did a lot of talks back in the day, a lot of panel presentations, and she would bring us along, me and my sisters especially, to hear and see what it's like to be a powerful woman connecting with, many different types of audiences. And when it came time for me to choose where I wanted to go to university, I knew I wanted to go down the communication or journalism path. So for the 4 years I've spent away from Chicago, I was in beautiful Columbia, Missouri, at the University of Missouri, or Mizzou, as we love to call ourselves. And that's where I really drilled down into what communication is all about. And it led me to my first job out of college. And I think I shared this with you, Sean, but I had a very unique and interesting communication role coming out of college. And as I tell people, once you learn this fact about me, you'll never forget it. But I was one of 12 hot doggers chosen out of 1,200. So as we say, Sean, it's harder to become a hot dogger than it is to get into Harvard. So I can hang that on my hat rack. But I was chosen to represent Oscar Mayer. I did drive the Wienermobile across this beautiful country, 32 different states I got to visit in my first year out of college. But the reason that this was a pivotal role for me to start my career was because I had to take what I learned in 2 weeks of corporate training at Oscar Mayer headquarters. And I had to use those messages, these corporate messages, and I had to connect with many different types of people. So whether that was a Good Morning America reporter in the middle of Times Square, whether that was a mom in a parking lot in the middle of Iowa who wanted to know what's actually in the hot dogs, to a radio interview in Washington State where they might have a bit more of a liberal questions that they wanted to ask me. I had to be able to flex and choose the right stories and examples and create a story for them that would resonate with them, that would be in their love language. That's where my career started. So then I spent a number of years back here in Chicago at a couple of different public relations firms. And this is advice that I would give anyone who is interested in pursuing a career, whether it's in communication or in communication coaching. Working for a PR agency gave me a chance to work with different types of clients and get to know how people learn and how people like to absorb information and how people like to be presented with information. So it gave me this great foundation for 10 years ago when I joined my mom's company. So that was always the goal. I knew I wanted to do and work alongside my mom and teach in the ways that she did. And I spent 10 years doing that. I spent 10 years coaching along with her, doing my own sessions and starting to weave in what I knew as a very old millennial, someone who grew up with social media and watching it, how it changed our communication. And I started to weave that into this 5-step method that I now teach. So that brings me to today, where really no 2 days are the same. And I would say that anyone who wants to get involved in coaching, like any other profession, reach out to people that you want to emulate. Reach out to me. I'm happy to help provide, advice and recommendation and guidance. But it is something you have to build up towards, similar to any accelerated, master's degree or doctorate. I like to think of myself as a master or a doctorate of communication coaching.
I think one key point I could pull out of there is you diversified your portfolio of experiences and tools. And I think not being a one pony and having the ability to wear a variety of different hats, talk to a variety of different people from different backgrounds is essential, because like anyone's organization, or in my case, athletics, you don't really know who you're going to get through the door, or if you're starting a new position, like what type of individuals you're going to have to approach and talk to on a daily basis. So you can't really be one track minded when it comes to how you like to communicate, you got to figure out also how others like to communicate and how you're going to be able to change and deliver that message to them on a regular basis.
Yeah, that's such a good comparison too, because as I think about, comparing what I do to athletics, you have to be able to, and this is something that I do have to do all the time. You have to be able to kind of read the room, read the field, and pivot and make a change on the fly if needed. So, for example, if I'm working with a client who's asking me to help them craft their story around a really important announcement. And as we start to get down the road of what that story looks like, and I start to see that there's a better way to tell that story, maybe we're just shifting and telling it in the perspective of the people that are going to be impacted by it. We have to pivot on the fly, and I have to help them start to shift their thinking. And it's not too dissimilar from an athletic coach or from a leader on a team who has to say to the team, okay, this is going to look and feel a little bit different, but it's for the greater good. So there is a lot of similarities. You're absolutely right.
And you mentioned social media. Obviously, that's a huge form of communication that's probably not going to go away anytime soon. How have you seen that shift from maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago to currently now? Like, maybe what are some of the positives of having this form of communication, but maybe how is this as hindering us, where you as a communication coach has to come in and almost reteach some people how to communicate because all they know how to do is through that format now. It is a phone.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's a few different things that I've noticed, trends that I've noticed, especially in clients who come to me and ask me, how can they better use social media or what kind of impact it's going to have? Because Sean, I was of the age that I remember when Facebook debuted. I was a sophomore at the University of Missouri, and I heard from a friend who went to the University of Chicago, and he was telling me about this new website where everyone at school has a picture and a web page. And finally, it made its way to the public universities. And when we got it, it shifted our social lives completely. And I'm kind of glad that I was able to have both sides of that. I went to high school before social media, but then I experienced college with it. And I saw this shift in how we connect with each other. Oftentimes, my clients are meeting with the people that they serve, whether that's a reporter, whether that's a potential client. They're meeting them on LinkedIn or on Instagram or Twitter before they're ever in the room together. So it's really important that they get their story right on these platforms where people get a sense of who you are pretty quickly. So let me touch on a couple of different elements of social media that I tend to focus on. And first of all, it's for LinkedIn. And especially for the listeners of your podcast, I encourage you, when it comes to your LinkedIn, remember that first about me sentence, that is your chance to tell someone what you're all about. Instead of listing all of your accomplishments or your past roles, I want to know who you are as a person. So we call it our why. And, some people call it your mission or your values. I call it your why. Why and what drives you to do the work that you do, so that immediately someone gets a sense of who you are. And have a great headshot on your LinkedIn so that when someone Googles your name, that's the first thing they see, your headshot and your why. And then when it comes to some of the more interactive platforms like Instagram or Twitter or Facebook, or as I joke, probably some new app that I don't even know about yet because I'm not cool. what needs to happen for those, and what I encourage people to do, is to remember that it's a two-way street. It's a two-way conversation. So when you are sharing something that you saw, maybe it's a news article, maybe you're sharing a link, instead of just sharing and saying something like great article or important study, add your sentence of value, add some value to why you're sharing it, give a moment of thought expertise, take advantage of that moment in time so that people engage back with you. And this is really important in today's world, because so often we just share a link or we comment on something and that's the end of the conversation. But these are missed opportunities, because we all need to be using social media to be social. Otherwise, it's just people talking at us, and no one wants to be talked to like that. So that's what I encourage. Two-way street. Make sure your LinkedIn is a good glimpse of who you are as a person. And remember that people want to engage with you. So that's really my top recommendations when it comes to utilizing these tools that oftentimes people forget were designed to connect.
Three good points that you said in there. One is, I was back in the day when there was AIM and AOL, and we didn't have any
Yep.
from high school whatsoever. So it's like, yeah, you had to actually go up to people and have a conversation, and then obviously to see where we are now. So I thought that was kind of pretty unique that you said that. I also like that
Mm-hmm.
you said, who you are as a person. I think that's one of the reasons why I ask, what are your roots or who you are before you even come on the podcast? Because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
people will give their rundown of all the colleges and places and degrees they've been at. And like, that's great. Like you have a good alphabet soup, but let me know who you are as a person and a human behind all those different things. Because I think at the end of the day, to
Yeah.
forge a relationship and to forge a bond with somebody, like you're going to need to know some of those details on a little bit deeper level. Like anyone can have a master's and anyone can have 14, 15 years of experience, but that doesn't equate that you're going to be a high quality practitioner or a person that we can work
Right.
with on a regular basis. And then,
Yeah, and it reminds me, Sean, of just on that. It reminds me of something my mom used to say a lot, which was, people have three questions for you when they're listening to you, and it's so what, who cares, and what's in it for me. And that's another reason I encourage people to put your why, put what you stand for, because they want to know what the experience of being in a relationship and connecting with you is going to be like.
yeah. And then you mentioned like talking at us. I think that's more important than ever, especially with the athlete population
Mm-hmm.
now. Before, if you look at, the old school, let's say, a coach is yelling at you, making you do stuff almost kind of as a drill sergeant, where now it's like you have to work alongside the athlete. Like you're not
Mm-hmm.
talking at them doesn't get the message across to them. They don't want to listen to it. They don't want to hear it. They just associate you with that. And then all of a sudden now they're tuning you out. And then now you're not able to get your message across with hopefully, education or whatever it is that you want to get across to them. Now you possibly lost them. And if you have that
Yeah.
one brief moment with them and that's your moment to connect to hopefully help you throughout the rest of the season with that athlete, and you don't take advantage of those couple of times, then it might be a really challenging time the whole rest of the year. So it's like those every moment you have to get in front of somebody like really makes a huge difference.
Well, yeah, I mean, it all boils down to trust. And that at the end of the day, that is really what I am coaching people to do, is to use communication to build trust. And we've all had those coaches that, in athletics or nutrition coaches who did that old school approach of just yelling at us and telling us what we did wrong. But we know the real coaches were kind of these models of hospitality where they welcome you in, they make you feel like you can be your authentic self so that you start to trust them. And then I'm going to be way more open to whatever recommendations that you're giving me because I trust you and I have a connection with you. That's absolutely right, Sean.
And that's one of the approaches we do with it's called Pro Habit. So that's our group education courses that we collaborate with our academic practitioners. Anything that, whether it's myself, strength, mental conditioning, whoever it is, we typically have a collaborative approach. We have an outline, we go over it, and we talk about ideas like what activities are we going to do? How are you going to present this information? How is this going to connect to them? Just different ways that the modern day athlete learns now, and how we can deliver that in a more appropriate way than let's stick a PowerPoint up here, talk at them for 45 minutes, and within 15 minutes in, they're disconnected. And we just wasted 30 minutes of their time because they didn't really pick up any of it.
Yeah, well, exactly. And Sean, you saw how I teach as well, and it's similar to that.
Mm.
I share my approach, but then most of the time I spend with clients when I'm teaching is in role play exercises and giving feedback based on what I see them doing. Because we really learn by doing, whether we're an athlete, whether we're a chef, whether we're a scientist in a lab, we learn by doing. And that's why I make sure that I can see people in action and learning the method and the strategies and my approach by how they actually present themselves so that I can give them live feedback and help them work on it in the moment, because that's how our brains will remember.
Yeah, and that was very beneficial because you did the activity within a couple of minutes and you recorded it as well, which I thought was super unique because like you're getting to watch your body language, you're getting to watch how you speak, you're getting to watch how the other person's interacting with you, and then boom, you're getting feedback right there. Here's a couple suggestions you could change in this moment. So if you get in the situation again, this is a different way how you could tackle it. So it's like now instantly I know how I can correct it. And like we did in those following exercises, now you can see if you carry that out going into the next activity that we did to see if you've improved that or not. So it's like you can then repractice that in real time later on in the exercise, which I thought was super helpful. So you talked about
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
you talked about working with all sorts of different clientele. Does it differ with your approach, whether it's CEO, an athlete, I don't know, maybe it's a mom that works with an organization, or you talked about your 5-step approach. Is it kind of the same thing for every person and you just kind of mold it depending on what they need?
Well, it depends. At the core of what I teach, whether it is a full day session like what we did with a group of registered dietitians, whether it's I have 1 hour with a CEO to help them prep for an interview with Kramer on Mad Money, it doesn't matter, because at the core of what I teach is this method, this strategic approach, is the 5 steps. So I often start there, whether I am refreshing within 5 minutes, saying, here's the flow, here's the infrastructure we need to apply to this story so that your brain remembers and that the person listening knows that you have a simple story simply told. But then it grows from there. And it really does look different depending on, what that client needs that day. So for example, next week, I am going to work with one of my food clients, and they asked me to come work with their marketing team to do a writing workshop. So I'm going to take my approach and what I teach, and similar examples even to what I taught you, Sean, real life examples of when you get communication right or when you get communication wrong, what it looks like and the implications and what we can learn from that. And then we're going to apply that to writing. So whether it's writing emails or creating really powerful presentations, we're going to spend a day and a half applying my method to that. Tomorrow morning, I'm working with a group of high school interns for one of my large medical device companies. And I'm helping them because they've been asked to represent this Fortune 500 company in media interviews to talk about their experience as high school interns, because it's really unique for a big company to hire high school interns. So my approach with them, well, again, same core strategy, but I'm going to make sure I tailor my examples and how I connect with them and the love language I use for high schoolers. So it really does depend, but at the heart of what I teach is the same strategy, the same approach to communication.
So what are these 5 steps then? What do those 5 steps consist of?
Mm-hmm.
And like you used an example there, like maybe a quick example, like this is how I would do step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just so the audience has an idea of how that looks, maybe in their head.
I should have had you do yours, Sean. Do your elevator pitch.
I know, right?
So essentially my goal is to help people tell their story in a way that others can go out and tell for them. And there's a flow that our brains naturally gravitate towards. And here's what it kind of sounds like. So I always encourage you, this is the number one thing that I teach, is to always start with the most important point first. So you know this based on your academic background, and I see it every day with, again, engineers and scientists and doctors. They like to give all of the how, all of the details and explanation, and then put the conclusion at the end. But in today's world where headlines are what people usually have the time and energy to read, we have to take that conclusion and put it to the top. So the first step in the 5 steps is starting with the why, not the how, and giving that most important idea first. Mm-hmm. And you'll remember I pushed you, Sean, and your colleagues in our session. Oftentimes I hear people start by saying something like, thanks for having me. Nice to be here. That's a good question. And I encourage you to get rid of that and give the audience or the person you're connecting with the gift of that idea. Start strong. Then step 2, I need to know why I should listen to you. What is your credibility? What is your background? Why are you the right person to be sharing this information, this thought, this idea? And then once you've established your credibility, you can set up the problem. What is the problem that you're solving for? What is the problem that we all face today? Who is the enemy in the room in this story? Because then you're setting yourself up to get to step 4, which is the solution. What is the unique solution that you or your team or your company can bring to the table that no one else can? This is how we differentiate. And then step 5, again, this is one of the most important steps, is when you bring it to life. So we've all been in classes with professors where they spend an hour setting up all of the philosophy and the background to a concept, but we really understand it when they give a real life example or when they bring in a guest speaker who can paint a picture of what that philosophy looks like in the real world. That's what step 5 is all about. I always encourage you to have a story or an example or a really compelling proof point that shows everything that you just shared, that really brings it to life. And the way that I encourage people to set up that step 5, that example, is by setting up with the formula problem plus solution equals result. So setting up, let me share the story of an athlete who just came to me because they are so confused about what they should be eating. So what I shared with them was our team's approach to getting to know you first and then creating a plan that is around your life. And the result, that athlete is having the best season of their life. And in fact, their team won the championship for the first time in 20 years. So again, I made that up, but that's what a compelling and strong story sounds like, Sean. It's concise, but it gets that moment of sustainable impact.
Why do you feel people are so tied to stories? Like they could, and you said this multiple times when I was there, but they could forget everything you talked about for, let's say, the 4 or 5 hours in your presentation, but you like tell one story and for some reason people connect with that. Like have you found a pattern of why that is?
Well, I can't take credit for this quote. This is a Maya Angelou quote. It's pretty well known, but people will forget what you did. They'll forget what you said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And stories create an emotion. Stories are how we connect with people. And stories come naturally to us. When we're telling stories, we're more inclined to gesture. Our face comes alive. I rarely hear verbal fillers like or yeah or so when someone's telling a story, because we can see it in our minds. When we can see it, we want it. When we see it, we can understand it. And that's why storytelling comes naturally. But if you just start with a story without the context of the first 4 steps, we're not going to really appreciate why that story matters. So that's why we have to make sure we get everything else in order first that leads up to that kind of crescendo moment, the Hail Mary pass at the end. That's what we're building up to, and we're just bringing it to life through a story or an example.
Yeah, just being able to, for some individuals, being able to connect with similar situations or issues or problems they've gone through can really hit home for them. And it's like now, I think you said a couple times, I remember those 2 words you said that provided this visual in my mind of this thing that I went through or something that I was associated with. It's like, now I'm locked in with you. Now I'm locked in with who you are, your name. And like, if something pops up and I had this, like, I just had this happen today, like an athlete just messaged me. He's like, yeah, you're the guy for nutrition. And that's why I texted you. Like, even though I work with such and such, like, I'm going to come to you because again, we had those moments where we worked together at the place I was at. And now, like, I'm his person that he trusts to go to, even though he may have somebody else. So it's like you said, those are strong over a long period of time when that happens.
Right. And I encourage everyone I work with, if you don't have stories right now that come to your mind or stories that lead to results or impact, start to look for them. Because once you start to look for the stories, once you start to ask people for their stories, you're going to develop even richer relationships with them. But you can kind of like think of it as a basket, and you're just kind of gathering your stories and examples, because it depends on your audience too. I would imagine that, you have a range of types of athletes that come to you, Sean, and you need to flex to examples that would resonate with them. To your point, finding something that they might see or they've experienced in their life so that they see a little bit of themselves in your story.
Yeah, and there's some athletes too, you may not have that connection or be able to have a story for them. So it's just like, that's where you have to ask a lot of questions, and maybe there's another path that you end up figuring out to get to know them. And that's just where you can be open-minded and have to kind of explore a little bit more if you don't have something to pull out of your back pocket. Now, you mentioned love language several different times. I think I was talking about this with you offline. I had just listened to a podcast with a strength coach that was at University of South Carolina. And one of the approaches he said he's done over the last couple of years was every single one of his players, he has them do the love language test. So he can figure out how to communicate with them, how they receive information, how they receive, I guess, quote unquote, love from him as an individual, as a coach, as a mentor. Is this something you implement, or could you give us some, more ideas on why this up a couple of different times?
Absolutely. I mean, the love languages books and the quizzes and the tests are so wonderful. And it was something I read, 15 years ago, but it still resonates with me today, obviously, because I've weaved this concept into what I teach. But if you think about that word love, what is love? It's just a connection. It's a really deep personal connection. And I have seen so often again, with every client, every industry, it doesn't matter if it's the dairy industry, it doesn't matter if it's with a tech company that's filing for their IPO. Every industry has jargon words that really mean nothing to someone like me or you, someone who's outside that industry, but it might be the most important person in the story because that's the people that you're serving. So to me, using love language is all about using the words and phrases and examples and stories that would resonate with anybody. So it's a more general conversation. It's more looking for those more general words that I can see in my mind. And if you have a jargon word that's really important to include, just defining what that means and what that is. So to me, love language is recognizing who you're trying to connect with, who ultimately at the end of the day will benefit from learning what you have to share, and using the words that they would recognize. Because I've seen this too, Sean, and this goes back to my experience working in PR agencies. Oftentimes you see people who are new and early to their career, they start to mirror what they hear their executives talking like, and words that they hear that they think that's how they're going to be able to kind of climb the ladder, is to mirror and emulate the people who are already at the top. But what I encourage them to do is to just be their authentic selves and be real, because there are strengths to using the love language that you've always used, because that's what comes natural to you, and to use the words and phrases that others will be able to recognize and connect with. And when it comes to also media conversations, that's how I encourage people to talk to reporters, because we can't see these jargon words in our head. I don't know what a marketplace looks like. I know what Chicago looks like. I don't know what a consumer looks like. I'm not a consumer. When I go to Target to get stuff for my kids, I'm going to buy milk and eggs and a toy. I'm not a consumer going to buy products. So that's what I mean by jargon, is making sure that we're looking for the love language of the people we have yet to serve, and weaving that into all of our conversations, whether it's internal or external.
Yeah, and that's something I started to do with our athletes here. Like, how do you like to communicate? What is your preferred learning style? Like, is there something I need to know about you that's going to help provide us a better conversation and relationship? And like, just being open and honest with them, and like you said, real, I think definitely plays a much bigger part when you're building that trust and relationship with the athlete, and they just appreciate that more. Like, no one wants to be BS. Yeah. No one wants to be told some fluff story that doesn't come true, or you don't follow up. That's where you start losing those connections, and all athletes
or
talk.
Sean, yeah. Well, yeah, of course. But and I would add to that list, speaking in a generic way. If an athlete gets the sense that you're giving him or her the same spiel that you gave 10 times before that, you're going to lose them immediately, because they won't feel that moment of connection. And I'll share with you, and my husband always laughs, because anytime we watch the NFL draft and the NBA draft, I usually have to leave the room when the person who's drafted comes off stage and does that first really awkward interview, because so often they miss the opportunity. They all kind of say the same thing. I'm excited. This is great, whatever. But the times where I come back in the room is when I hear them personalize the story, whether it's this is an amazing moment in time for my family, growing up in Pittsburgh, this was our dream and we worked so hard to get it. Or when they kind of honor the team that has just selected them, Green Bay, I can't wait to come join your community and, do big things for all of you. So again, using that love language and making it personal and localizing it, that's another great way to find that connection where you're using the love language of that person that you have yet to serve.
Yeah. And sometimes it just takes time. It takes time. It
does.
The willingness to be open. It takes you to be someone that's willing to sit down with the individual. And sometimes some people have short fuses and are not willing to do that. And just with our fast-paced society and no one wanting to take that time, unfortunately, it almost kind of becomes a rare trait for some people to hold.
You're right. You're so right. And I get asked that all the time. How can I continue the momentum of what I just learned? And I say the same thing. I say, you have to work at it and hold yourself accountable. Ask others to hold you accountable, to get rid of some of these habits that we just broke in our time together. Habits like saying, I think, or I feel, I believe, using filler words, not localizing, not personalizing the story. Hold yourself accountable. And then sometimes they come back and we do a 30-minute refresher, just like you would with an athlete, to remind them of some of the strategies that worked for them. And then you send them on their way, and it's back to practicing and weaving it into your everyday life. But as I told you, awareness is always the first step, Sean. And once you become aware of some of these communication habits, it's a lot easier to start to change your golf swing.
Yeah, changing your mindset and changing your attitude towards it definitely plays a big difference. Some people, when they're just have that curtain over their eyes and I can't do anything wrong, or this is the approach I've been doing for 40 years, like, you really got to take a step back sometimes, really analyze, where am I really at and how am I going to be able to take a step forward to help whoever that specifically is. As we kind of finish up,
you're right.
one thing I wanted to ask you was you mentioned about waking up early, and I see a lot of successful
Mm-hmm.
people, getting up at 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning, to kind of start their day. Why is waking up early, let's say in your case, a key component to
Mm-hmm.
your
Yeah.
success?
Yeah. So I also attribute this to my mom. This was something, growing up, she was the mom of 5 kids. My parents had 5 kids in 7 years, no twins. So she had 5 kids. She owned her own company. She was very involved in the community and had the busiest social life of anyone I've ever known. And yet she every morning made sure to wake up before anyone else in our house did, to get in a workout, to take some time, quiet time to reflect, to go for a walk, whatever it was. I watched her do that. And when I started to travel with her for work throughout the last 10 years, I started to recognize what an important moment in time, moment of the day that is, as someone who has a lot on their plate. So what it looks like in my life, I like to wake up, between 5 and 5:30. Some days I get on a Zoom with a trainer I've been working with since the pandemic started. She does group workouts 3 days a week with heavy weights, and it's amazing in my dungeon. That's my dungeon time. Some days I wake up and I sit on my couch, which faces the east, and I kind of watch the sunrise. Sometimes I'll write, sometimes I'll journal, but it doesn't really matter what you do in that early time of the day. I have found whether some mornings I wake up and I'm just working and prepping for the day. It's that quiet, deliberate, intentional time to gather your thoughts and give yourself that gift of, everyone talks about self-care today, but that to me is the ultimate gift of self-care. The intentional time of quiet and being alone with your thoughts, it makes a huge difference. And I think it's why I've been able to get through the past year building this company on my own and still raising my 2 boys, traveling a ton, but having fun too. And it helps so much with mental health, is waking up a couple hours before the rest of my house.
Yeah, you spend so much time giving to everybody else that you need those 1 or 2 hours a day to just do something for yourself. And also the
Mm-hmm.
biggest plus of getting up early, like you said, it's quiet. There's nobody up, there's nobody texting you, there's nobody emailing you. You're not getting bombarded by a bunch of people at, every
Mm-hmm.
wake and turn, every moment of the day. It's just like when you have those
Right.
3 hours of yourself, you're just like, I can mentally and physically prep myself for what's going to be happening coming in the day, instead of waking up later and then you
Mm-hmm.
get slammed with it as soon as you wake up, and then you just start in such a stressed, kind of mindset to start the day, and that doesn't always help, especially if you have
Yeah. Yeah.
rigorous.
Your cortisol is like through, yeah, your cortisol is through the roof and you haven't even eaten breakfast yet. So I agree. And there's also ritual to it, that I know my brain really likes, because since so many of my days look different, having the ritual of having those first 2 hours of the day feel and look the same, that also helps me just, ease into the day with that lower cortisol level and being able to just handle whatever else comes my way. So that's a really good point that you just made, Sean.
Well, really appreciate having you on today. I think a fantastic amount of information is going to be locked into here. Obviously, if anyone wants to contact Caylen, anyone wants to utilize her services, anything of that nature, that'll be in the show notes. More information about her will be in the show notes. All my digital links on my link tree will also be in there as well. So if you need to contact me, and I think, the series of people I've been having on the podcast lately has been super important, because, we have a lot of dietitians, strength coaches, sports psych, but I think our athletes and our practitioners learning some of these other tools that can improve them as a practitioner, or figuring out how they can add that to their toolbox, I think is going to be extremely impactful, if they want to continue to keep growing and getting better. So thank you.
Thank you, Sean. And Sean, if I can share my anchor statement, because it really applies to everyone that I know listens to your podcast, which is people don't care what you know unless they know that you care. And that was something that I immediately learned about you, Sean, is that you really care about the people that you work with and this podcast. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate that you care so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I can hope to continue to keep doing that, as I keep moving along in my career.